You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining the American Revolution. This week, episode 347, The Constitutional Convention's Biggest Fight. Last week, we covered how the Constitutional Convention spent about 3 days just setting up procedures and selecting the officers that would run the way the convention worked. So it was really not until Wednesday, May 30th, 1787, that the Committee of the Whole finally got down to business on what they were all there to talk about. Chairman Nathaniel Gorham brought the committee to order. Their first point of discussion was the Virginia Plan, which was introduced by Edmund Randolph, but largely written by James Madison. Before we dive into that, I just want to say that typically with this podcast, I've tried to stick to events in chronological order. I'm going to depart from that slightly for the next few weeks. I want to focus on several of the constitutional debates that occurred during the convention, but the delegates did not just deal with one issue and then move on to the next. Instead, they debated an issue for a while, then they went on to a different one, then they came back to the first one again. Since I want to focus on this important event over a few episodes, I'm going to take a look at a particular issue or set of issues in each episode and then cover those issues through the course of the debate over the entire convention until the delegates reach their final outcome. So today, we're going to talk about the biggest issue that had to be tackled by the convention. That was how the states would be represented in Congress. In the Continental Congress, as in the convention itself, each state received one vote. It did not matter that more than 10 times as many people lived in Virginia as did in Delaware. Both got that same one vote. From the perspective of the Confederation Congress, this made sense. The Congress was just a coordinating body between the states on how to deal with Britain and run the war. It was not involved in making the bulk of the laws that impacted people. It essentially served as a regional international body that coordinated affairs on behalf of sovereign states which needed to work together. Supporters of proportional representation saw this new Congress that they were inventing at the convention as something that would have more regulatory power. Representatives in this new Congress would be elected directly by the people and would legislate on their behalf. It made no sense that some people would have much greater say in Congress simply because they lived in a state that had a smaller population. The 7 smallest states made up only about a quarter of the total population, which would have a majority say in Congress. That was simply anti-democratic. Supporters of equal votes for states were more concerned about competing state interests. Many small states had suffered from having to give in to their larger and more powerful neighbors. Larger states had frequently set up systems to their own advantage. Large states would not even have to consider the interests of smaller states. Virginia, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Massachusetts contained a majority of the entire population. If they could agree on things, they would never need to do anything that served the interests of the other states. Before the convention had even begun, the Pennsylvania delegates had suggested that proportional representation should be a given for the new government. Anything else would make this new government a collection of states rather than a single united country. When Delaware's delegation showed up with instructions that they could not even negotiate on the matter of equal representation of states, it showed that there were many on each side that were fundamentally unwilling to negotiate on this point. On the very first day of debate, George Reed told the delegates that the Delaware delegation was prepared to walk out and leave the convention if the delegates voted for proportional representation. It appears that a majority was in fact prepared to support it, but no one wanted Delaware to leave on the first day. So after some consideration, they tabled the debate on the issue and moved on to other things. The issue lay dormant for a couple of weeks until on June 9th, William Paterson of New Jersey called for the debate to be renewed. New Jersey was a leading supporter of equal votes for states. It was a relatively small state and was threatened by larger neighbors such as Pennsylvania and New York. The same day that the debate renewed, another leading advocate of the equal vote system arrived in Congress, Luther Martin of Maryland. The New Jersey delegates argued for a continuation of equal state representation. In addition to the argument that small states would be overwhelmed in a proportional system, They also argued that the convention did really not have any authority to make such fundamental changes to the Confederation Congress. This whole convention had been called to suggest a few additional powers, not fundamentally rewrite the power structure. In response to these arguments that proportional representation was critical to making the government accountable to the people, another New Jersey delegate, David Brearley, offered a suggestion. Rather sarcastically, he noted that if states no longer mattered, perhaps they should just redraw all the state lines so that all states had an equal population. Of course, he knew full well that the larger states were not going to shrink in size so that their other state neighbors could grow. By the end of the day, everyone realized that a majority still supported proportional representation. The Equal States faction once again requested that the matter be tabled. The following week, on June 15th, Patterson proposed an entirely new plan in place of the Virginia Plan. He introduced what came to be known as the New Jersey Plan. This plan looked much more like what many delegates had envisioned when discussing a federal convention designed to amend the Articles of Confederation and not replace it with a completely new government. Under the New Jersey Plan, voting in Congress would work the same as it always had under the Articles of Confederation. There would be a single House, and each state would receive one vote. Supporters of this plan noted that this convention was not called to create a national government. It was designed to make some amendments to the Articles of Confederation to make it more workable. The Confederation consisted of a group of sovereign states that worked together for their common interests. Creating a Congress where states were represented by population would mean that smaller sovereign states would essentially lose their sovereign status. They would have no way to prevent larger states from imposing their will on the other states. Equal voting by states was critical to the sovereignty of these smaller states. Further, there was no need for two houses of Congress. Each state had a vote in Congress. Gumming up this process with some elitist second house could thwart the will of the representative house and went against the idea of representative government. This notion of an upper house was similar to the House of Lords in Britain. There was a small group of elites who could thwart the more popular house based on no real legitimate basis, only their elite status. A single house in Congress was just fine. So essentially, leaving the basic structure of the Continental Congress as is, the New Jersey Plan went on to address the real changes that its supporters thought were necessary to amend the Articles of Confederation. One of the big problems in the Confederation Congress was the inability to raise money to pay off war debts and other debts. This plan authorized Congress to tax imports, to impose even a stamp tax, and also through postage fees. Tax evaders would be tried in state courts, but there would be appeals going to a new federal judiciary. Congress could also raise additional funds by demanding funds based on a state's population, including 3/5 of all slaves. The Confederation Congress already had this power, but the plan advocates suggested that giving Congress greater powers of enforcement. The New Jersey Plan also recommended an executive branch. Perhaps it would be a committee, though, that would be in control of the military and other government functions. The executive could be removed by a majority of state governors. The plan recommended the creation of a federal judiciary, appointed by the executive, and which would hear cases involving impeachments of federal officers, as well as certain appeals from state courts. The New Jersey Plan declared that laws by Congress would be the supreme law of the land, thus overruling any conflicting state laws. State judges would be required to uphold federal laws. It also gave Congress the power to admit new states into the Union, establish a uniform rule of naturalization, and ensure that citizens of each state received equal treatment when they were before the courts of other states. That's a quick summary of the New Jersey Plan. Under the plan, Congress would not change much at all from the way it operated under the Articles of Confederation. Rather, this plan simply added executive and judicial branches into the mix. There were a few tweaks to congressional power, like they would no longer need a unanimous vote to requisition taxes from the states, but there were no major structural changes. This New Jersey Plan was meant to be a more comprehensive plan, addressing more than simply the question of proportional representation, which we're talking about today. This was meant to serve as a basis for all of the changes that the Constitution should consider. For the prior 3 weeks, all debate had centered around the Virginia Plan, which recommended this entirely new form of national government. So the New Jersey Plan was designed to bring the overall debate back to the idea of just making some reasonable amendments to the Articles of Confederation without creating an entirely new government from scratch. These two visions would dominate the remainder of the convention, which still had many more months to go. For now, though, I'm just going to focus on how the New Jersey Plan shaped the debate over the issue of representation in Congress. Before we dive back into the debate over proportional representation versus equal representation, I should mention there was another proposal for a different kind of representation. Several delegates suggested that representation should be on wealth. This was raised particularly by South Carolina's delegation, which thought that its slave population was a measure of its wealth and which would be included in any system of taxation by the federal government that should give them a greater number of votes in Congress. The debate over wealth representation was not limited to the slavery question, though. Gouverneur Morris, for example, who was an outspoken opponent of slavery at the convention and other times, also supported the idea of representation based on wealth. States which contributed more to the federal government in the form of taxes should have a greater say in the policies of that government. The idea of representation being tied to the level of taxes given to the government, and that taxes would be tied to the wealth of each state, meant that wealthier states had more taxes and would also get more votes. So this idea has some support in both the wealthier free states as well as the southern states. Later in the convention, this idea was dropped. Southern states were happy to let it drop in favor of representation based on population, as long as 3/5 of their slaves were counted in that population in order to give them more power. The general consensus was that this was going to be a republic, which means people should be represented equally. Wealthier people should not be given additional voting power simply because of their wealth. So now we're going to get back to the main representation debate that took place after the New Jersey Plan was placed on the table. This was the big debate over whether people should be represented as individuals, meaning that big states would get more votes, or whether each state should be represented equally. Patterson, the author of the New Jersey Plan, pointed out that a proportional plan, where states like Delaware and Georgia had 2 delegates, would require a federal House of more than 180 delegates in order to be proportional, and that a second House half that size would increase the total size of government to a really unworkable 270 people. That seemed absurdly large and would be a great expense to operate. A single-house legislature did not need a second house as a check. The Executive Council and the states served as a check on the federal legislature under the New Jersey Plan. That was all that was needed. All that Friday and the next Saturday, the delegates argued over the 2 plans. James Wilson of Pennsylvania was one of the strongest advocates for proportional representation. From his point of view, the government was supposed to be from the people. It was the people who should be represented in Congress, not the states. If each state had equal representation, the people of some states would simply be more powerful than others, and that was completely unacceptable. Ironically, at the time, Wilson's home state of Pennsylvania did not have proportional representation. In Pennsylvania, each county, plus the city of Philadelphia, had 6 representatives. That was the same regardless of population. Some counties had over 30,000 people, while some had less than 5,000. Yet, each county had the same representation in Pennsylvania's state legislature. The following day was a Sunday, so both sides had a chance to regroup and reconsider other options. On Monday, Alexander Hamilton took the floor for the entire day, criticizing both the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan. This was the longest speech given at the convention, and Hamilton was, by far, the most extreme nationalist at the convention. He proposed a government that had proportional representation, but he wanted an elected chief executive who would sit for life and who would appoint all of the state governors. The president would also have the power to veto all state and local laws. This was much closer to the colonial model where a king sitting for life would appoint all colonial governors. In fact, Hamilton had said that he considered the British model of government, as it was practiced in Britain, to be, quote, the best in the world. Now, many of Hamilton's extreme views were shared by no one else at the convention. he would not even get anyone to second his motion to introduce his plan. Many began calling him a monarchist. His speech did, however, have the effect of making the Virginia plan's radical changes seem much more moderate in comparison. The following day, Madison rose to attack the New Jersey plan. He argued that it could not fix the major defects that existed in the Articles of Confederation. The states would continue to hold too much power, leaving the federal government impotent. Foreign powers would continue to drive a wedge by negotiating directly with the states. At the end of the day, a vote was called on the issue. The delegates voted in favor of proportional representation by a vote of 7-3 to 1. New York, despite being a fairly large state, voted with the small states in the minority. The other two delegates outvoted Hamilton. New Jersey and Delaware also voted in the minority. Maryland had only 2 delegates present and each canceled out each other's vote, so they were the one. For the rest of the week, the convention debated a number of other issues related to the Virginia plan, but the equal states faction were not happy. The only reason they did not walk out of the convention was the hope that they could revisit this issue again. Delegates realized that even if a majority supported proportional representation, if that meant 4 or 5 states might refuse to join the Union under those terms, that would be devastating. Now, there was, of course, an obvious compromise. As early as June 11th, even before the introduction of the New Jersey plan, Connecticut delegate Roger Sherman raised the idea of having the states represented equally in the Senate while having proportional representation in the House. Neither side was happy with the idea at the time it was introduced. The equal states faction still only wanted a single-body legislature. The proportional votes faction saw that they had majority support to have proportional representation in both houses and did not want to give the small states more power in either of the 2 legislative bodies. For the rest of June, the convention did not really consider the vote to have proportional representation in both houses. The equal states faction accepted the reality that the best they were going to get was equal representation in one house and proportional representation in another house. So that was the so-called Connecticut Compromise, since it had been first introduced by Roger Sherman of Connecticut. The minority equal states faction still had the power to walk out and prevent the convention from having any real chance at all for ratification. So just before the 4th of July break, Franklin suggested the creation of a, quote, grand committee to come up with an acceptable compromise. The committee would consist of 1 delegate from each state. Most of the hardcore advocates of proportional representation, men like Hamilton, Wilson, and Madison, were not placed on this committee. On July 5th, the day after the Independence Day break, the committee chairman, Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts, reported the committee's recommendation that the Senate have equal representation for each state and that the House have proportional representation based on their populations. Of course, the committee's recommendations did not settle the matter. The proportionalists, who knew the majority supported their views, continued to fight. Madison, Wilson, and Gouverneur Morris continued to argue for proportional representation in both houses over the next 10 days. Their argument was essentially that the small states benefited the most from a union of states and that they were not going to walk away from all this. If they did, the large states would probably just conquer those smaller states in open warfare and eventually absorb them. And nobody wanted that. Charles Pinckney proposed a compromise that would put the states into different classes in the Senate. Larger states would still have more representation in the Senate, but the smaller states would still get disproportionately larger representation than their populations justified. Wilson and Madison got on board with this plan. They hoped that would be enough for the small states, but the small states, however, suspected they could win on equal representation in the Senate, and they voted down that compromise. The following day, July 16th, the delegates held a vote on the Grand Committee recommendations, and they approved it 5-4. Connecticut and North Carolina accepted the compromise, along with the small states that had been fighting all along, New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland. New York probably would have voted yes as well, but its delegates had already left the convention, and so New York did not vote at all. The Massachusetts delegation was tied and didn't vote. While the hardcore supporters of proportional representation were not happy with this outcome, they did accept the result and did not try to revisit the issue for the rest of the convention. Next week, we're going to take a look at other issues regarding the creation of the new federal Congress. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show, part of the Airwave Media Network. I want to give thanks to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis, Mike Hager, John Celentano, Michael Mulhern, and Mitchell Anderson. Thanks also to Robert Morris Circle supporters, TJ Walker, Ron Thorson, and Curtis Johnson. I also want to welcome new standard bearers Jay Davidson and Jerome Wilson, who joined at the standard bearer level this month. Like everyone who supports the podcast on Patreon at the $10 level or higher, they will receive a magnet each month with a different flag from the American Revolution. And remember, if you join me on Patreon for as little as $2 a month, you get access to commercial-free episodes and invitations to live events. Thanks also to Chris Coates for a generous one-time gift via Venmo. I really appreciate gifts. If you don't want to make an ongoing contribution, just want to send me some money as a one-time gift, I absolutely appreciate it. Finally, I want to recommend anybody who buys things on Amazon. I have a deal with Amazon this month. They're going to give me a bonus if a lot of people buy stuff based on my recommendations. So if you're going to buy anything on Amazon anyway, doesn't matter what it is, if you click on one of the book links from my blog or any of the other links to Amazon from anything I pretty much put up, I get credit for your purchases, even if you buy something completely different than what the link took you to. So if you could just click on one of my links and then make whatever purchases you're going to make anyway, I get credit for that, and that overall helps this podcast. So thanks for that. So this week, we're going to talk about the biggest fight at the convention, which was whether states would be represented equally or whether people would be represented directly. Now, I know today that debate does not seem like a big deal. We argue about all sorts of things in the Constitution these days. None of them has to be over proportional representation or equal representation. But that was the big fight at the time. While there was obviously self-interested concern, depending on whether you came from a large state or a small state, as to how this power would be distributed, the fight really was about more than that. It was about whether this government should simply remain a council of separate sovereign states that would coordinate common interests, or whether it would become a truly national government that represented all the people as a single nation. Now, of course, we all probably know that the United States have more or less evolved into the latter. The convention left this question mixed. The House of Representatives became a place where the people would be represented. The Senate was meant to be a body that represented the state governments. Now, for more than a century, state governments chose their senators. There was no election of senators. It wasn't until the passage of ratification of the 17th Amendment in 1913 that people began to elect their senators directly. It's also worth noting that one restriction in the Constitution that could never be changed by constitutional amendment was that states would be entitled to equal voting rights in the Senate. As I said, I think most of us today think of the United States as a single nation. Few of us feel particular allegiance to our home state. We may have some state pride in it, but compared to our feeling of allegiance to the United States generally, I think allegiance to a state takes a second place. Personally, I've lived in 5 different states, and no one thinks of moving to a new state the way people think of moving to a different country. That is because the American people today think of themselves as Americans, not as a citizen of a particular state. And that was the apparent goal of many nationalists at the convention, but it was very far from the common view at the time. Most people considered their state to be their country, and they considered neighboring states to be rivals, much the way we would look at, say, Canada or Mexico today. That view took generations to evolve out of, and it really didn't become the common understanding until after the Civil War. Nationalists, men like Hamilton and Madison, were unhappy with the compromise that was made to give these smaller states inordinate power, but they also realized that without compromise, many of those states would never have accepted the Constitution at all, and they firmly believed that unity was more important than getting their complete vision enacted. I also, as a side note, mentioned in the main episode that Pennsylvania at the time had a single state legislature where all the counties were represented equally. At the time of the convention, many Pennsylvanians were already unhappy with that model. In 1790, Pennsylvania adopted a new constitution which created 2 chambers, a House and Senate, and members of both of those houses would be elected based on districts of equal population. Like most states, Pennsylvania's constitution has been completely rewritten many times over the course of the years, the most recent being in 1968. My book recommendation this week is Miracle at Philadelphia, the story of the Constitutional Convention, May to September 1787, by Catherine Drinker Bowen. I've already recommended a couple of other good books about the convention, and this is another one. It goes through the various debates and tries to put them in context. The book was first published in 1966 and is about 300 pages, not counting notes and index. The author was a pretty prolific writer in the mid-20th century. She also wrote biographies of John Adams and Benjamin Franklin. So if you want to read more about the convention debates, get Miracle at Philadelphia by Catherine Drinker Bowen. Now for my online recommendation, I'll note that last week I recommended Madison's Notes of the Federal Convention and noted that James Madison was in fact the primary source for most of what we know about the convention. Madison left us with more than 600 pages of notes on the convention, but there were other sources at the convention as well. There were, of course, the official records that mostly captured various motions and votes. There were also nearly a dozen other delegates who kept partial notes for part of the time they were at the convention, as well as many letters and other writings from the delegates after the convention ended. So, for those of you who think just going through Madison's notes is not enough, and you really want an insanely higher level of primary sources, I'm going to recommend The Records of the Federal Convention of 1787, which is edited by Max Farrand. This is a 3-volume set of records totaling nearly 2,000 pages. It goes through all the available primary sources from the convention and breaks them up so that everything appears in chronological order. This makes it really easy to look at different accounts of the same debates side by side. The editor of these volumes was a professor of history at Yale University in the early 20th century. His books were published in 1911, which of course means they're in the public domain today. I've included links to the books on archive.org as I usually do. I've also included a link to the online Liberty Library. The book on archive.org is basically like a traditional book that you can flip through. If you look at the book on the online Liberty Library, it appears more like a web page. So if you prefer searching and reading for things that way, you may prefer that source, but they are the same book. You can get them from either place. My question this week comes from Brian Cox, who asked, if Francis Marion was leading the American force against Lieutenant Colonel James Coates instead of General Thomas Sumter, would he have prevented the British from successfully retreating to Charleston? Would the British have even made it to Shubrick's plantation from their initial retreat from Monk's Corner? Well, for everyone else, before I get into the specific answer, this question is in reference to the Dog Days campaign in South Carolina in the summer of 1781. And I covered those events in episode 292 of the podcast, if you want to go back and listen to it. At that time, South Carolina Militia General Thomas Sumter consolidated militia forces, and he also had some support from the Continental Army in their joint efforts to push the British and Loyalist forces back into Charleston. The British outpost at Monk's Corner was a good defensive position inside a fortified building, Biggin Church. Sumter attacked but did not have any artillery, so he could surround the enemy, but he couldn't take the building without taking heavy casualties. As a result, the British who were in the building were able to slip away during the night and escape. The Americans saw this, caught up with them, and there was a clash at Quinby Bridge that took the British a bit by surprise. The Americans eventually cornered the British at Shubrick's plantation. And again, although the Americans outnumbered the British had a very good defensive position, and the Americans were very low on ammunition. In spite of all this, Sumter sent orders to attack the entrenched enemy. That attack failed. The militia then withdrew since they were out of ammunition after that fight, and they would have been decimated had the British counterattacked that night. Sumter's orders, in fact, caused many militia to vow that they would never fight under his command again. All right, so let's get to the question. What if Marion had been in command rather than Sumter? Now, of course, it's always easy in hindsight to second-guess a military commander whose strategy did not work, and who assumed a different commander would have done better. Much of the fighting in this campaign was rather chaotic, and Marion was part of the force. He commanded a division under Sumter during this whole fight. Many of the problems for the militia came down to moving too quickly and not remaining a cohesive force, and I don't know that Marion could have done any better at that than Sumter did. Marion had used similar strategies when he was in full command of troops. Had the militia remained cohesive and not moved so quickly, the British would have had even more time to effect their retreat. So I'm not sure Marion would have done any better. We would all hope Marion would not have ordered that futile failed attack on the British at Shubrick's plantation, but that hesitation also would have given the British more time to retreat or to get more support for their position. So while Marion in command might have prevented that costly charge, it's not clear what else he might have done differently to prevent the successful British retreat back to Charleston. And in fact, after Sumter left, Marion organized his own ill-advised attack on a superior enemy force at Parker's Ferry a few weeks later. The real problem in this whole campaign seemed to be the lack of ammunition and resources that would allow the South Carolina militia to remain in the field and on the attack. Whoever the commander would have been, they seemed to be doing the best that they could with the limited resources that they had. Even the Southern Continental Army under General Greene was being starved of resources at this time. The main army up north was gathering everything it could for the big Yorktown campaign, and the Southerners were pretty much left on their own. So while it is easy to be critical of General Sumter and his many limitations, I'm not sure that any other commander would have done any better in the same situation. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me either via email or on X, Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.